Είμαι η Bonna Wescoat, διευθύντρια της Αμερικανικής Σχολής Κλασικών Σπουδών στην Αθήνα. Είναι η τιμή μου να σας καλωσορίσω εδώ απόψε για να τιμήσουμε έναν υπέροχο φίλο και συνάδελφο, τον Robert Ousterhout, ο οποίος έφυγε από κοντά μας το 2023 σε ηλικία 73 χρόνων. Έζησε κάθε ένα από τα χρόνια πλήρως, αφήνοντας με μία κληρονομιά βιβλίων, φίλων και φοιτητών που είναι τώρα συνάδελφοι. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, colleagues and students. I'm Bonna Wescoat, Director of the American School of Classical Studies in Athens, and it's my honor to welcome you here this evening to honor a wonderful friend and colleague, Robert Ousterhout, Bob, who left us all too soon in 2023 at the age of 73. He lived each of those years fully, leaving a legacy of books, friends, and students who are now colleagues. This evening, we're fortunate to be able to gather together some of Bob's friends, colleagues, and family to celebrate his life, and there will be an opportunity to share memories and experiences from the audience at the end of our program, and then we'll follow this with a reception in Bob's honor. I'd like to turn now to my colleague, Maria Georgopoulou, Director of the Gennadius Library, to introduce our program. Maria.
Thank you, Bonna. You would be surprised what we do here in the American school. Americans speak Greek and Greeks speak English. Γεια σας και από μένα. Είναι τιμή μου που σας έχουμε εδώ και εγώ τουλάχιστον θα συνεχίσω στα αγγλικά. Είναι λίγο δύσκολο να αλλάζουν γλώσσες. It is with a very heavy heart that I stand up here on the stage of Constantinople Hall, where Bob Ousterhout has appeared so many times to enlighten us with his knowledge, wonderful personal stories and adventures about the art of Byzantium and the connection of Byzantine architecture to the world. A dear colleague and a good friend to me personally and to so many of you in this room and elsewhere in the world, Robert Ousterhout was one of the most important scholars of Byzantine architecture in the world. A pioneer in the field, he literally wrote the book, or rather the books, on Byzantine architecture. Master Builders of Byzantium, 1999 and 2008, and Eastern Medieval Architecture, the building traditions of Byzantium and neighboring lands, in 2019, for which he was awarded the 2021 Justice Medal by the Medieval Academy of America. Born in Oregon, where he stayed through college, Bob completed his master's degree in Cincinnati and his PhD at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, where he served as professor for 20 years. Before joining the Department of the History of Arts at the University of Pennsylvania in 2007. An attentive professor and thoughtful mentor to his students, a wonderful guide on the field and in the basement of buildings in Istanbul, a dedicated proponent of faithful restoration, Bob Ousterhout dedicated many years of his life in the restoration of Byzantine monuments in Constantinople, namely the Pantokrator complex, Zeyrek Jami, until political issues put an end to such campaigns. His dissertation on the Karya Jami and the monumental publication that brought him close to Dumbarton and it was, of course, just the first glimpse of what was to come for the monastery of Hora. And the two books are The Architecture of the Karya Jami in Istanbul, 1987, and The Art of the Karya Jami, which was published in 2002. His survey of Cappadocia brought to the fore a more archaeological and landscape-oriented view of the lunar environment of Cappadocia that was to crown his achievements and efforts in the end of his life. Toward two books, The Byzantine Settlement in Cappadocia, Dumbarton Studies, published in 2005, and Visualizing Community, Art, Material, Cultural, and Settlement in Byzantine Cappadocia, again from Dumbarton Oaks in 2017, bracket the famous Cappadocia in Context International Summerfield School for Koch University that he co-directed from 2011 to 2022 with Tolga Uyer. Among his other books, I should mention the two volumes he co-edited, Piroshka and the Pantokrator with M. Sagi, Budapest, 2019, and The Holy Apostles, A Lost Monument, A Forgotten Project, and the Presentness of the Past with Margaret Mallet from DO 2020. His earlier books include the Byzantine monuments of the Evros Meriç River Valley, Thessaloniki 2007 with Charalambos Bakirtzis, and the essential teaching materials for class remain the Blessings of Pilgrimage, 1990, and the Sacred Image, East and West, that he co-edited with Leslie Brubaker, as well as, of course, his studies on the Holy Sepulchre as an architectural model and inspiration in Western European architecture. We will now hear today from few colleagues and close friends and family who traveled to Athens from close and far to participate in this event. I want to thank Brian Rose for providing us the slide presentation that you will see again in a moment, that actually really contains and includes many moments and very wonderful moments from Bob's life. Numerous other students, colleagues and friends who could not be with us today have sent messages and much love. As I'm sure you know, his students Vasilios Marinis, Emmy Papapalexandrou and Jordan Pickett produced in 2021 a festschrift in Bob's honor entitled Architecture and Visual Culture in the Late Antique and Medieval Mediterranean, Studies in Honor of Robert G. Ousterhout. For us here at the American School, it's a privilege to host this event to celebrate the life and achievements of our beloved Bob. So now we will ask Charalambos Bakirtzis to take the floor, and he will speak to us in Greek, but his lecture is also translated in English, and if anyone needs a translation, just let us know.
Κυρίες και κύριοι, ευχαριστώ τη Διευθύντρια της Γενεδίου Βιβλιοθήκης, κυρία Μαρία Georgopoulou, για την πρόσκληση να προσφωνήσω τη σημερινή ομίγυρη στην εκδήλωση μνήμης για τον φίλο, συνάδελφο και αγαπητό συνεργάτη Ρόμπερτ Ousterhout. Πρωτογνώρισα τον Μπομπ, όπως τον αποκάλεσαν οι φίλοι του, το 1984 στην Καβάλα και κατόπιν στην Ουρμπάνα, Ιλινόης. Τότε στο Πανεπιστήμιο University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign δίδασκαν βυζαντινά θέματα ο Henry Maguire στη σχολή Art and Design, ο Bob στη σχολή Αρχιτεκτονικής και η Eunice Maguire εργαζόταν στο Granite Art Museum ως curator. Οργάνωναν διαλύσεις και συζητήσεις στα Illinois Byzantine κολόκβια, προσκαλώντας ομιλητές και συγκεντρώνοντας γύρω από αυτούς ενθουσιώδη ομάδα φίλων του Βυζαντιού. Ο Μπομπ ήταν μαθητής του αειμνίστρου Σολομόντων Τζούρτζιτς και ο Τζούρτζιτς μαθητής του Ρίτσαρντ Κράουτχάιμερ. Ο Κράουτχάιμερ είχε δώσει με τα βιβλία του το πανόραμα της Βυζαντινής αρχιτεκτονικής, ο Τζούρτζιτς έστρεψε το μικροσκόπιο της επιστημονικής έρευνας στη Βυζαντινή ναοδομία και πολεοδομία και ο Μπομπ, όπως θα εξηγήσω στη συνέχεια, κατανόησε ότι τα βυζαντινά κτίρια ζουν σε αρχαιολογικό περιβάλλον. Ο Μπομπ για πολλά χρόνια επισκεπτόταν ανελειπώς κάθε χρόνο τη Θεσσαλονίκη και τη Βόρεια Ελλάδα, μελετώντας από κοντά τα βυζαντινά μνημεία. Είχε επιδοθεί μάλιστα με επιτυχία και στην εκμάθηση της ελληνικής γλώσσας, ώστε και διάλεξη να δώσει στα ελληνικά. Αυτός είναι ο λόγος που σήμερα εκφωνώ ελληνικά στη μνήμη του. Σήμερα θα αναφερθώ στην πλέον άγνωστη περίοδο του Μπομπ, όταν το ακαδημαϊκό έτος 1986-1987 ήρθε στην Καβάλα και δούλεψε ως visiting scholar στη 12η Εφορία Βυζαντινών Αρχαιοτήτων Ανατολικής Μακεδονίας και Θράκης. Μέναμε σε σπίτι στυλ Bauhaus στην οδό Υψηλάντου. Εμείς στον δεύτερο όροφο και ο Μπομπ στον πρώτο. Ήταν μέλος της οικογένειας και έχοντας γραφείο στην Εφορία, στο εμβληματικό μέγαρο τόκου στο κέντρο της Καβάλας, μετήχε σε όλες τις δραστηριότητες. Φιλικές συγκεντρώσεις, βυζαντινές συναντήσεις, αυτοψίες στους Φιλίππους, τη Δράμα, Αμφίπολη, Σέρες, τη Μονή Τιμίου Προδρόμου, Ξάνθη, Άβδερα, Βυστονίδα, Παπί και Ρόλος, Κομωτινή, Μαρόνια και κυρίως στον Εύρο, Κοσμοσότερα, Διδημότυπο και Πλήθη. Παρακολουθούσε ανασκαφές, καταγραφές και επεξεργασία ευρημάτων, στερεωτικές εργασίες και αναστηλωτικές εκβάσεις στα μνημεία μαζί με τα μαστόρια, συντηρήσεις ψηφιδωτών, τοιχογραφιών. Δούλεψε με τον Ζώη στη συγχώρηση και συμπλήρωση κεραμικών, καθαρισμό νομισμάτων και έργων μικροτεχνίας. Βοήθησε τα μέγιστα στην οργάνωση του πρώτου Διεθνούς Συνεδρίου για τη Βυζαντινή Θράκη, πρόσωπο και χαρακτήρας, στην Κομωτινή τον Μάιο του 1987, όπου παρουσίασε πορίσματα αρχαιολογικής έρευνάς του σε 2 παλαιολόγιους ναούς στο Δημότιο. Βοήθησε στο στήσιμο της έκθεσης για τη Βυζαντινή Θράκη στο Αρχαιολογικό Μουσείο Κομοτηνής, επιλέγοντας αντικείμενα και μεταφράζοντας τα αγγλικά κείμενα και λεζάντες. Ως μέρος της εφορίας βυζαντινών αρχαιοτήτων, γνώρισε από κοντά τη μνημιακή τοπογραφία της περιοχής ανάμεσα στη Θεσσαλονίκη και την Κωνσταντινούπολη. Για την περιοχή αυτή έγραψε αργότερα πολυσήμαντες μελέτες, τοποθετώντας τα μνημεία της Θράκης στον αρχαιολογικό χάρτη της περιφέρειας της Κωνσταντινούπολης και της Βυζαντινής αρχαιολογίας. Κατανόησε επίσης γιατί η αρχαιολογία είναι τρόπος ζωής, ταυτοχρόνως και επιστήμη και διοίκηση, χωρίς ωράρια εργασίας. Και κατάλαβε γιατί η διεύθυνση τροχέας Κομοτηνής είχε δώσει συντολή στους τροχαίους να μην σταματούν το υπηρεσιακό αυτοκίνητο της εφορίας τις νυκτερινές και μεταμεσονύκτιες ώρες όταν επιστρέφαμε από ολοήμερες αυτοσίες. Μαζί μας έζησε την αγωνία και τον αγώνα για τη διατήρηση της άβρας των μνημείων και από κοντά τους προβληματισμούς για τη στερέωση της κοσμοσότητας στα φέρα, την εγκατάσταση του συστήματος μελέτησης μικρομετακινήσεων. Όταν, για να μην επιβαρύνουμε στατικά το κτίριο, αρνηθήκαμε να σκάψουμε μέσα στην κοσμοσότητα των τάφρων κτίρια Ισαϊκίου Κομμουνού και αρκεστήκαμε μόνο να τον εντοπίσουμε κάτω από τον βορειοδυτικό τρούλο, χρησιμοποιώντας προς έκπληξή του τη μέθοδο του ραδιοσκοπισμού, αντιλήφθηκε ότι και στην αρχαιολογία ενίοτε ο μύθος είναι ισχυρότερος του γεγονότος και η διατήρηση του μνημείου ισχυρότερα της ερμηνείας. Λίγα ακόμη για την κοσμοσότητα. Όταν δουλεύαμε στη συντήρηση των μολυδοφύλων στους τρούλους της Εκκλησίας, ξαφνικά ένα περιστέρι φτερούγησε και κάθισε στη σκαλωσιά κοντά μας. Τότε μας ήρθαν στο νου όσα ο Ισάκιος έγραψε στο τυπικό της κοσμοσότητας. Ενώ καθόμουν γράφει σε σκαμνή και παρακολουθούσα τα έργα των παστόρων, είδα περιστέρι με χρυσίζοντα λαιμό να κάθεται ανέλπιστα και ήρεμα σε κάποιο δοκάρι στη μια πλευρά του άδειτου. Μια μέρα, πηγαίνοντας ο Μπόμπ στο διδημότικο με νοικιασμένο αυτοκίνητο που οδηγούσε ο τεχνίτης των ανασκαφών μας Στέλιος Παπαδόπουλος, στη είσοδο των Φερών, στην πέτρινη γέφυρα του Αηδαροπνίχτη, το αυτοκίνητο ντελαπάρισε ξαφνικά και έμεινε μισοκρεμασμένο στο κράσταδο της γέφυρας. Ήταν η Παναγία Κοσμοσότητα που τους προστάτευσε υπό την σκέπη της. Ο Μπόμπ ήταν σε όλους αρνητός. Δεν είναι τυχαίο που ο λόγιος Μητροπολίτης Αλεξανδροπόλεως και αργότερα Παναγιώτατος Θεσσαλονίκης κύριος Άνδρος, μαθητής του Λομαθάκη, εόρτασε στην κοσμοσότητα τα γενέθλια του Μπόμπ, που συνέβηκαν με τα γενέθλια του Ισαακίου στις 16 Ιανουαρίου και οι φεριώτισσες γειτόνισσες ετοίμασαν ωραιότατες στραγιώτικες πίτες για τη γιορτή. Ο Μπόμπ είχε το ελεύθερο και εμπενόβιανο στο γραφείο του Μητροπολίτη, ο οποίος τον αποκαλούσε με τη χαρακτηριστική εκκλησιαστική εκφορά του ονόματος του Μπόμπ με διπλό όμικρο. Ο Μπόμπ δεν ξέχασε τη θητεία του στην αρχαιολογική υπηρεσία στην Καπά. Το 2007, στο βιβλίο για τα Βυζαντινά μνημεία εκατέρωθεν του Εύρου, έγραψε «Νεότερες έρευνες αναγνωρίζουν την αξία της αρχαιολογίας και του υλικού πολιτισμού στη συγγραφή της ιστορίας». Όλα αυτά και άλλα που θα μπορούσα να πω είναι για να εξηγήσω ότι όταν αργότερα ο Μπομπ έστρεψε την επιτυχή και πολύ σπουδαία δραστηριότητά του στην Κωνσταντινούπολη, την Καππαδοκία και τη Βυζαντινή Ανατολή, ήταν ήδη προετοιμασμένος και εξοπλισμένος με εμπειρίες αρχαιολογίας πεδίου, τις οποίες γνώρισε συμμετέχοντας στις δραστηριότητες της μάχημης 12ης Εφορίας Βυζαντινών Αρχαιολογικών Καβάλας. Eius memoria sit eterna. Έχουμε 5 εικόνες. Πώς θα το δω? Ναι, μέσα είναι. Γυρίστε το πίσω.
Turn it back.
Δεν είναι είμαστε εκεί ακόμα.
Είναι παρουσίαση. This is with in 1984 we did it at Anactoropolis near Kavala during his first visit in Kavala. In his apartment in Kavala, he organized a party for the Euphoria. This is in front of Cosmosotira with the Bishop of Alexandroupolis, Mr. Anthimos, the mayor, the director of police of Fair, officers of the army next to Fair. His birthday. The Euphoria Bob is next to Penas. The first on the left is the Euphoria during the first international congress about Byzantine phrase during the visit at Cosmosotira. At the Synax near Maronia, we found an early Christian Basilica after transformed to a Middle Byzantine monastery. This is the refectory. The members of the Euphoria Pope is sitting on the throne of Eunice. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bakirtzis, for sharing these wonderful thoughts and your images with us. Henry and Eunice Maguire will take the floor now.
Eunice and I first met Bob 45 years ago in the garden of Charalambos in Washington, where, among the white azaleas of the annual spring symposium, we were introduced to him by Slideshow Church, who wished us to meet his most promising student. Since it is impossible to compress so many years of friendship into the space of 10 minutes, we chose to concentrate on the theme of gardens, in particular on a memorable week that we spent with Bob touring the gardens of Constantinople. For almost 20 years, from the mid-90s, Bob rented a house in the old city of Istanbul during the summers, near the Byzantine imperial palace. From this space, he carried out his work and entertained a constant stream of guests. We were lucky to have been his guests for a week in 1997, when I was preparing a paper on the gardens and parks of Constantinople for the symposium that was to take place at Dunbar-Notes in the following spring. Bob offered to guide us around the locations that, on the basis of texts, I had deemed to be the sites of renowned but now lost Byzantine gardens. We started inauspiciously with the garden of Bakirtzis, so lovingly described by its creator in his poem To Himself, where he laments the loss of his estate. Bob took us to a district below the Cardiajami that was occupied by scruffy auto repair shops, but which still preserved some fragmentary remains of Byzantine structures. Perhaps, he suggested, this would have been the site of the fabled garden. But instead of the beautiful meadows and ever-flowing streams of water described by Bakirtzis, we found only a derelict garage stuffed with old tiles, filled with a greenish slime, at the back of which there was indeed some overgrown Byzantine masonry. It was certainly hard to imagine the loveliness of the garden of Bakirtzis that may or
not have been there before. Undaunted, we set off the following day to find the site of the 10th century palace and park of the Arete, which is principally known from the writings of Anna Komnena and John Geometries. According to the Byzantine authors, the garden had formal fountains and sculptures said to have been more accomplished than those of Praxiteles, Phidias, Lysippus, and Polykleitos. On the basis of the texts, I had convinced myself that the estate was to be located on a low hill that rises just outside the land walls, where they meet the sea at their southern end. We climbed to the top of this rise, only to find a huge industrial shed, its roof collapsed and its floor filled with what looked like broken slabs of asbestos. We waded in vain through this debris in search of 10th century remains. But then Bob came to the rescue by taking us down to the base of the hill to show us an early Ottoman fountain, which was a successor to the Byzantine fountains in the park above. Furthermore, this fountain incorporated a relief carving of a goose, which was plainly not Ottoman but Byzantine and datable to the 10th or 11th centuries, albeit restored. It is possible that this sculpture was one of those that originally adorned the fountains of the adjacent park of the Arete, even if not everyone would agree that it is more accomplished than the work of Praxiteles. Our final and most exciting expedition was to the 11th century gardens that surrounded the monastery and palace of the Mangana, laid out by Constantine Monomachos below the present ramparts of the Seraglio. This estate, with its extensive lawns, fruit trees, canals, basins, and bars, was described in rhetorical terms by Psellos as an example of the emperor's extravagance. Until recently, the area was a restricted military zone. Notwithstanding its inaccessibility, through the kind offices of Engin Akurek, Bob was able to arrange a visit to the site, which today has two main terraced levels. A high wall rises between the levels. This terracing was described by Psellos, who said that some of the groves of trees were suspended in the air, while others were set on the flat ground below. During our visit, Bob confirmed the veracity of Psellos' account by pointing out areas of recessed brickwork characteristic of 11th century construction at several points along the massive terraced wall separating the two levels. Because many of the lawns of the site had been preserved by the military, this was probably the best example of a Byzantine garden to survive anywhere. None of these discoveries would have been possible without Bob's amazing knowledge of Constantinople, where no fragment of surviving masonry escaped his attention. I arrived in Istanbul steeped in the texts, but it was Bob's knowledge of the material remains, scant though they might be today, that brought the high-flown language of the Byzantine authors down to earth and gave credence and substance to their descriptions. Our tour of the gardens of Istanbul revealed Bob's extraordinary knowledge of the city, along with his sense of adventure, his fondness for exploration, and not least his legendary generosity towards students, friends, and colleagues.
Bob cultivated inquiry, digging, planting, pruning, and shaping ideas as if they were garden architecture, and nurturing his own and others' research. A list of resulting interactions would read like a seed catalogue. His gardening tools included a sharp eye for inherent incongruity, as when he spotted the Byzantine relief reused in the Ottoman fountain. Like a good gardener, he could also find congruity in what most people would not connect. This gift was related to his fondness for puns and limericks. I wish I could show you the drawing he gave me when Granite Art Museum opened a small multimedia exhibition I had curated at the request of the music department at the University of Illinois to commemorate Mozart. A number of fanciful and garden birds in 18th century contexts were included in the exhibition, which I had called the Magic Flute. Bob's drawing had a personified column, fluted and with a curly acanthus capital as its head, playing a transverse flute with the caption, "Don't forget the column fluting." In 1986, 2 weeks before the deadline for his first book, The Architecture of the Kaya Cami in Istanbul, based on his dissertation, he had turned up on my doorstep in Urbana, Illinois, carrying his fast inkjet printer, which he insisted on lending me out of concern for the trouble I was having producing the final draft of my dissertation on a slow letter-by-letter printer. And when his last book was published, he made sure to tell me he had traveled to Washington to consult at Dumbarton Oaks that long-buried work of mine so as to refresh his understanding of Byzantine column capitals. In Istanbul, in a hidden walled garden, what do we do to get this?
I think you got it now.
I think you've got it, yes.
Eunice, it's okay now.
It's okay.
Oh, okay, thank you. He introduced us to the Topkapi conservator of architectural sculpture in her workshop and examined with us the sculptural elements from the Church of Aios Paliuktos lying there on the ground, knowing they particularly interested me. Now the next slide is the one you see up there on the right. We can leave it at that, I think. He explored in photographs the marble sectile flooring there of the Pantokrator Church, asking why its hidden scrolling vegetation was inhabited with birds, ferocious animals, and mythological beasts. And spying heraldic-looking birds and animals among the foliage of architectural sculpture such as this miniature Capitol, Bob recognized them as a way to glorify imperial power through timely intercultural and enriching material associations. Such work led far beyond the barren deconstruction of architecture. His archaeological enterprise extended to exploring many of the deep resources of the Penn Museum, unearthing the contributions of distinguished predecessors, including textiles from Roman and Byzantine Egypt, such as this fragment excavated at the Fayum by Flinders Petrie. In the museum's seldom explored storage areas, the groves, orchards, and recesses of the collection's historically varied material landscape, he invited his students and colleagues for research, for special seminars, and for the making of exhibitions. On what was, I think, my last visit to his house in Philadelphia in an autumnal season, he handed me a basket before dinner and invited me to take it to the small vegetable garden to see what remained of all that had been gracefully planted far from the Oregon vineyard of his family past, between the kitchen and a newly built gate out to the public street. When I asked whether I should choose only a selective medley, his answer was that I should make a full harvest. With his book, Eastern Medieval Architecture, The Building Traditions of Byzantium and Neighboring Lands, he has left us an exemplary full harvest and opened a welcoming gate.
And now Scott Redford of SOAS, University of London, will take us a little bit further east, I imagine, or not.
Thank you, Maria. Unlike my predecessors this evening, I just threw my hands up and said, I cannot summarize decades of friendship with images, so you'll have to put up with just listening to me, I'm afraid to say. The American School of Classical Studies in Athens was the first American overseas research center. There are 25 of them now. Founded 80 years after Athens, ERET, the American Research Institute in Turkey, is a stripling besides the American School in Athens. I begin my talk with these two schools for obvious reasons. We're here together in one of them, thanks to Maria Georgopoulou's initiative celebrating the life and work of our friend Bob Ousterhout. And Bob was an enthusiastic participant in the activities, user of the libraries, donor, tour leader, and part of the intellectual life of both schools. There's also a personal reason for me to open my talk in this manner. I would not have met Bob Ousterhout when I did and how I did it without the American Research Institute in Turkey, Istanbul branch. I was in Istanbul in 1986 working on my dissertation, and Bob was on the trail of one of his many interests at the time, something that perhaps he learned about in his time in Thrace, which was the overlap between Byzantine and early Ottoman architecture, in this case in Bithynia, one that resulted in an oft-cited article and whose this topic has been carried on by his former doctoral student, Suna Çağatay. Even back then, as an assistant professor, he was exploring links between Byzantine and neighboring architectural traditions. And this was a self-taught interest, born, as we've heard, of close examination of vaults and domes, yes, of course, but also, these are terms I learned from him, put-log holes, mortar beds, and the size of bricks. No one taught Byzantine art and architecture at Harvard while I was studying there for my doctorate. Starting in Istanbul in 1986, Bob became, if not my teacher, my go-to person for things Byzantine. He encouraged me back in the United States to start giving papers at the annual Byzantine Studies Conference, introduced me to Eunice and Henry Maguire, and to Maria Georgopoulou, and they and others schooled me, to use the phrase, in Byzantine art. In Greece, he introduced me to Charalambos and Bakirtzis, the Bakirtzidis, as he always called them, referring to the whole family, of course, including Olga and Nikos. Just to give you an example of this schooling, one example. One time I was going on about this or that motif in Seljuk art that was similar to something in Byzantine art, and he said patiently, "Yes, it's true what you say about Byzantine and Seljuk art, but actually we can see the exact same thing in the brickwork of Neomoni." Oops, very putting me in my place, but in a pleasant way. Of course, Neomoni was built before the Battle of Manzikert and before the Seljuks even existed in Anatolia. So I learned my lesson, but I still haven't been to Neomoni. Exchanges of ideas took place when Maria, Bob, and I met to discuss common interests in artistic overlaps in the medieval Eastern Mediterranean. Bob gave me a very hard time when I referred to them as not as overlaps, but to interpenetrations, as drew a face when I used that term. By that time, Maria, also interested in intersections, shall we say, of Christian and Islamic traditions, had published several important articles on Crusader and Islamic art, and Bob on Crusader architecture. And of course, it goes without saying, his magnificent work on the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. This subject and these three people crystallized when we were approached by the Getty Foundation to run a study tour, a study program for them as part of their Connecting Art Histories seminar series. This resulted in a movable feast of a seminar that took, was it 12 or 13? I can't remember. Students of the medieval Eastern Mediterranean who were from the countries of the Eastern Mediterranean on study trips to Greece, Turkey, Israel, and Jordan. And believe you me, you haven't discussed the Crusades until you've discussed it with people whose homelands were occupied by the Crusaders. It was quite an interesting experience in many different ways. Needless to say, Bob, never happier than when in front of a building talking to interested students, was the star of the program, giving unstintingly of his time and energy, even at a time when he was battling cancer. The same love of learning and teaching continued over the course of two subsequent Getty programs, excuse me, the last one online during COVID lockdowns. The COVID lockdown, and Brian will know better than any of us about this. The effort of leading a 2-hour online class would cause him, he said, to sleep for hours afterwards, but he never, ever canceled a single online class. Bob and I shared an interest in what is usually called heraldry. The term heraldry, of course, refers to Western medieval traditions. As with everything he did, Bob learned by looking closely at buildings, and on the walls of everything from fortifications to church chapels, he observed the proliferation of certain patterns, there's one on the screen, together with more widely recognized figural reliefs of things like rampant lions and double-headed eagles. Now, when Byzantine art historians, which they do rarely, treat heraldry, or to use a more neutral phrase, the visual language of power, it is related to the presence of the Franks in the region, whichever region of Byzantium this is. Interestingly, for me, as an Islamic art historian, there is an absolute similar parallel in the teaching of of Islamic art in which heraldic-like motifs and patterns are also attributed to the coming of the Franks. And this was all, we were all discussing this before the word Eurocentric had dominated, entered into the academic conversation as it does now. Bob, as disciplined and prolific as always, wrote several major articles on the subject of Byzantine and allied heraldic expression, and I, many fewer, I'm afraid to say, but both of us agreed that it was high time to re-examine this Crusader-centric, shall we say, paradigm. Now, in the time allotted me today, I raise heraldry as just one example of the many subjects that he wrote about, convinced of their interest as much, if not more, by his own fieldwork as by scholarly literature, which would then catch up with what he would say. It is one of the many topics that when I see something new, like for instance, the Byzantine pseudo-Kufic inscriptions discovered just last year in Antalya in southern Turkey, I say to myself, oh, next time I see Bob, I'll bring this up with him. Or, oh, why don't I write Bob about this? My deepest condolences to Bob's partner, Brian, and to all his friends and colleagues gathered here this evening and online. Thank you very much.
So when you can start the PowerPoint, I will start where Scott left off, and obviously I have a dual role here tonight as director of the Gennadius Library, which is part of the American School, and this is a place, the school, that was always close to the heart of Bob Ousterhout, an institution that he has come back to over and over again. And in many ways, a way to connect with Byzantine art in Greece, especially in the Peloponnese. And I wanted to mention out of Nafplio and his dear friend Mary Lee Coulson, later in the Aegean Islands, but also in Athens and Turkey. Bob, as you see him here in this hall in 2005, his scholarly output has been so rich that before I knew him well, I would imagine him as ancient. And then I realized that we were of the same generation. And then I felt so small, and I continue to feel so small. But what has always impressed me and touched me about Bob is his generosity. He was always well-read, thoughtful, but generous about sharing his ideas, thoughts, and materials. And he was ready to listen. He was ready to listen to all of us, especially the locals, to think and to see what we felt and what we thought about our land and our monuments. So he came back to the American School often to give the Walton lecture, and because of his connections with the Thessaloniki and the Bakirtzis, it was the one time where the lecture was repeated in Thessaloniki. He came back to speak about Cappadocia, and in 2022, in June, he gave this brilliant lecture on rethinking the Greek School of Architecture, Byzantine architecture, and it was the last time I saw him. He also regaled us in 2012 with a Greek version of an exhibition that was based on his work about John Henry Haynes, Picture in Anatolia, the photographs of this photographer, and a colloquium that brought together archaeologists from the American School and archaeologists who had worked in Turkey, along with the great rare books of the Gennadius Library, and you see some of the images here. Jennifer Niles, and Tassos Stanoulas, Anna Balian, and Jim Wright. This is, to my mind, a way of really showing that what the founder of the Gennadius Library had wanted was actually put into practice. To be sure, those of us who were lucky enough to be in Athens in the summer would receive his planned itinerary that you see in the loop slides that we saw before. And in these itineraries, several places would float around: Philadelphia, Athens, Istanbul, an island, Cappadocia, and back home, with stops and addresses and phone numbers. Let me stop here my personal remarks to read something from Tassos Tanoulas, one of the regular hosts of Bob in Athens. That's Tassos speaking. It was so thoughtful from Maria Georgopoulou, director of the Gennadius Library, and dear friend to all of us, to take the initiative of organizing this gathering in honor of the memory of our mutual friend, the late Bob Ousterhout. I'm grateful to her for counting me in the ones who could contribute something valuable to this event. I regret that I'm unable to be at the gathering in person, since the date of my knee surgery, which was done only 2 days ago, had been arranged months before. I have therefore asked Maria to read the following short text on my behalf, and Maria, with her usual generosity of spirit, accepted. Bob's wide and important scientific work in Byzantine studies is well known, but I consider that others are more competent than I to speak of it and to point out its value. I feel that I have to limit myself in referring to the friendship that bonded Bob and me since 1995. I date the beginning of my friendship with Bob in 1995 when he hosted me at his home in Champaign, Illinois, during my CRES lectureship that year. It was then that the quiet, sympathetic camaraderie which characterized our relationship to the end was established. From then on, in Athens, Titos Papamastorakis and I regularly hosted him in the house we both shared. Sometimes he could stay at Mary Lee Coulson's while she was still living in Athens. In 2005, he invited Titos Papamastorakis and me to Istanbul to show us the work he had done on the central and northern churches of the Pantokrator monastery, as he had sensed that, from then on, the license from the Turkish state would be discontinued. He accommodated us in the old picturesque terrace house he kept near the Hippodrome. I shall never forget the revelatory experience of walking once again through the old city and its monuments, guided by two deep experts of the topography of Constantinople and Byzantium in general. After Titus's death in 2010, it became a comforting habit for Bob to stay by me when he passed through Athens at the beginning and end of the summer in Greece and Turkey. We often shared our love for swimming. Bob was a passionate and skilled swimmer. As soon as we were into the water, he disappeared in the horizon, only to be seen after some time coming out looking the happiest of humans. It was touching that he stayed true to this annual cohabitation of ours in a ritualistic, I might say, way. It was also, for me, a repetition and intimacy that showed that the things of the world are still in place. The COVID pandemic interrupted the regular pace of these habits, and that interruption proved, alas, fatal. For me, that daily routine we shared a few days a year, the resharing of intimacy and relaxation, even some mild tensions during his illness, come back and will always come back to my memory, stating another painful and dark void that time leaves behind when it erases the voices of friends who are lost, more and more often as we grow older. From my home where I am, I share the nostalgia for the presence of our dear friend Bob and the bitter taste of certainty for this everlasting separation. And here you see Bob and Tassos on the Parthenon on the occasion of the visit of the Byzantine summer school of the Gennadius Library on the site. I wanted to talk a little bit about my own experience of traveling with Bob and planning with Bob and Scott. In July 2009, I had the privilege to travel to Eastern Anatolia with Bob, Zaza Skirtaze, and Nino Simoshvili, with a special focus in the Tau-Klarjeti region. I recall his kindness in explaining every detail, his effort to decipher our different accents, a misunderstanding in a Georgian church about the Holy Kitten, which turned out to be the holy chiton, chitones. Lunches with fruits and vegetables washed in a nearby river or fountain, trying to communicate with our fearless driver, Eugene. The numerous times we felt that Scott Redford would have had an answer on the spot, but he was not with us. Our trip was simply fabulous, and I'm especially grateful for the fact that Bob shared with me his photos, as there was something wrong with my camera, so it felt as I could see through his own lens what global Byzantine architecture was. And of course, this is one of the many trips that resulted in this fabulous book. I have a big regret. In 2005, we plotted with Bob and Scott to have a Byzantine summer school here at the Gennadius Library and to combine Greece and Turkey. I forget why, it felt very difficult. We didn't do it. So I was very happy 10 years later, when, thanks to Scott Redford, we managed to run this fabulous Connecting Art History seminar, where we traveled to Turkey, Israel, Greece, and Jordan. And these are some of the images from that trip. This was a path-breaking seminar, as Scott explained, and it was about the Crusader period. And presumably, Bob was going to learn from us. I don't know that he learned very much. But what I wanted to share with you, along with the fact that there he was in front of monuments, in museums, taking pictures, taking notes, very serious. He also talked to us about the aha moment. So let me share the story. While visiting the compound of the Knights of St. John at Acre, and that was in '99, not at the time that this picture was taken, we were there for a conference on Crusader stuff. Bob noticed that in the latrines, the ribs of the vaults had fallen, with the exception of surviving corbelled springers still bonded in the corners of the room. A close examination of the vaults similarly indicated that the ribs were not bonded to the webs. In several places, the ribs had fallen, but the vaults were in place. This indicates that in terms of structure, the ribs and the vault proper functioned separately, and that the ribs were not providing any structural reinforcement for the vaults. And he wrote a very important article about this. Needless to say, I hadn't noticed very much next to him when we visited these latrines. And this photograph has been shared by Michalis Olympios, one of the members of that seminar, and he writes, "I would like to share the attached photo of Bob striking a characteristically medieval pose while trying to get good shots of the architectural detailing during our trip to Akko. I somehow find this a very compelling image, encapsulating his dedication and sense of adventure, to which others among us who knew him more intimately have already referred." Edna Stern, who is an archaeologist in Israel, tells us, "Among many memories, I particularly recall our visit to Almina, the site of Crusader Port St. Simeon, where Leonard Woolley excavated in the 1930s, and Arthur Lane, who studied the pottery, identified the colorful glazed Port St. Simeon ware produced there. Robert turned to me, to Edna, as the pottery specialist who published on this ware that was exported from here to Akko, and insisted we find a sherd of this pottery. I was skeptical, noting the site was completely destroyed, built over, and planted with an orchard. There and then, Robert crossed the fence and searched the dirt piles, eventually returning with a tiny sherd of the ware. His huge smile and sense of accomplishment were unforgettable. This was Robert. Everything was intriguing, an adventure, and every riddle had to be solved. Papadopoulou. When I was a graduate student in Paris, Robert Ousterhout was an almost mythical name in Byzantine studies.
But I think I will always remember him as a fellow traveler in Turkey, Greece, and Israel during the Getty Connecting Art Histories program on the art of the Crusade. He always managed to combine his own work, constantly photographing and studying the monuments we visited, with insightful presentations to the group and helping others, understandable, as she says, even by the architecturally challenged, as he put it. I still remember, Paona continues, me thinking during his presentations in Hagia Sophia and St. Euphemia in Istanbul that it was a pity I could not record what he was saying, not only because of the content, but also because of the way, playful with humor and his notorious puns that led him to characterize St. Simeon, the first columnist. So here he is, really being serious on the field. And here is one of these little drawings that Eunice referred to. This is Daphne that Bob drew on a piece of paper, on a napkin at the restaurant. Heba, Mustafa. I attach here a photo of Bob and I in Athens, which he titled Bob Heba Angel when he sent it to me, which captured perfectly his incredible playfulness and fun-loving side. I remember vividly the moment he saw this sculpture and felt that it would be quite funny to pose next to the angel and cheer him up. Eva Hoffman. The image of Bob in my mind, with his wonderfully sly smile, is that of a creative groundbreaker. First was his surprising, unlikely pairing of adventure and Byzantine art, which he pursued as an inseparable, infectious passion. Bob was also a rule breaker. Studying and preserving art located in Greece and Turkey, he showed the study of art and history as the path toward cultural commonalities and connections. And what can be more important in our world today? Bob perfectly embodied this wonderful poem by Mary Oliver. 3 things to remember. As long as you're dancing, you can break the rules. Sometimes breaking the rules is just extending the rules. Sometimes there are no rules. So, it's really very moving and very difficult to talk about Bob. And our picnic table is set, the hat is there, the glasses are there, but he's no longer with us. Stratis Papaioannou of the National Research Foundation here in Athens will share some thoughts.
I also have some images to share. Right. Before I begin, let me also thank Maria Georgopoulou for inviting me to be here today, and most importantly, for organizing this event in memory of Bob Ousterhout, a memorial which, as he rightly observed, must be done also in Greece, a place and a people that Bob cherished so much. It was almost 2 years ago that, by a very happy fortune, I had the honor of presenting Bob in this very room when he gave the lecture that was already mentioned on rethinking the Greek School of Byzantine architecture. Maria was, happily for me, late from a trip, and she asked if I could replace her in presenting him. And I took the opportunity, as he himself would later remark, to thoroughly embarrass him by lavishing praises on him, saying things like, here is a scholar that has essentially redefined our understanding of the architectural lingua franca of the Mediterranean world and taught us how to look at Byzantine buildings and objects at the crossroads of both East and West from the perspective both of technology and the medieval conceptions and experiences of the sacred. and so on, and so forth. There was no exaggeration in my praises. It was only a small tribute, in fact, to his work. But for me personally, it was also a very small public thank you for the many ways he had been inspiring and supportive in the about 18 years I had the privilege of knowing him. Now, it was rather easy to speak about Bob Ousterhout when he was present in person here at the audience. But I must confess that I find it much more difficult to speak about him after his death. For in so many ways, death often commences an astonished silence, so you will allow me to be brief and a bit Ousterhoutian, I hope. To the predicament of the mourner, what makes me additionally uncomfortable is also the fact that the group of today's speakers includes giants in the fields in which Bob Ousterhout was active, the history of architecture, art history, and archaeology. I am just a philologist, but I guess this is the point. Bob Ousterhout was not simply a brilliant archaeologist and art and architectural historian, but also a Byzantinist, who encouraged younger colleagues, regardless of field or interest, with his lucid, admirably uncluttered writing, with the near savagery sometimes of his forthrightness, his unreluctant mastery, like his master builders, as scholar and teacher. So others are much more qualified to speak about his scholarly achievements. So I would like to bring forth some fragments of images from that Ousterhout as he was perceived by apprentice Byzantinists, the perspective, in other words, of the Ousterhout disciples like myself. A comment about the title of this gathering is in order. The very last thing I received from him was his book of short stories, which a couple of years earlier he had also shared with me in draft form. The word reluctant in the title of that volume references a story within the collection titled The Reluctant Stylite. The story is about Silas, who had never intended to become a stylite or a columnist, as we heard before. All he wanted when he became a monk at the age of 15, we read in the story, was ironically a roof over his head. Forced to become a stylite by his fellow monks, Silas is at a loss. His first problem is how to deal with his bodily functions, which were gradually becoming urgent. So what does he do? He opens his robe and urinates into the wind. It all seemed so absurd, he found himself in a fit of giggles. What follows is typical of Bob the storyteller. As the wind blew, the monks were greeted by an unexpected moisture. It's like a miracle, they declared. The stylite laughs and it rains. In the rest of the story, Silas proceeds to become a bad stylite, in the hopes that the fellow monks will let him down from the column. But to his surprise, whatever bad or silly he does, it is perceived as an act of holiness. The story ends with Silas tricking the abbot to take his place on the pillar and fleeing. The title of the story originally, in fact, featured as the title of the entire collection of Bob's book, which at some point, I'm not sure when, was turned into the more general title, Reluctant Stories. This was perhaps a self-referential comment by Bob, who felt himself as a reluctant, perhaps, storyteller. But as many of us could testify, reluctant he was not. Take, for example, his long engagement with Cappadocia. In his publications on the subject, he challenged the earlier scholarly status quo on the Byzantine habitation of the region, which was in Bob's view predominantly domestic rather than monastic. Meanwhile, in the Koch's graduate summer workshop, or also already mentioned, Cappadocia in Context, he co-directed with Tolga Uyar between 2011 and 2022, he taught students how to think differently. Some of my students attended the program, and I can testify to how transformative they felt the experience had been. Most quotable among their encounters with the Ousterhout phenomenon was the notorious oath they had to take at its conclusion. Here are some quotes from that text, and you can pick your favorite line. On my honor, I do solemnly swear to do my best, to do my duty, and follow the model of my adored leaders, Bob Oustratilatis and Tolgas Peleophylax, to go underground in holes and labyrinths, in dens and burrows, to willingly crawl into tunnels, to identify wine presses without sounding disappointed, to gladly call a pentative, even if it isn't quite a pentative, to feel at home only in non-touristic underground cities, to instinctively distrust German scholarship, and to never ever date any Cappadocian painting to the 12th century. Amen. This Bob Oustratilatis was just one of his Protean transformations, but the one I would like to remember is this one, when he performed no less a person than the Emperor Justinian in an improvised staging of a late 19th century play. Here he was, a Byzantinist, unreluctant to not only masterfully impart scholarship, but also to play with it, and play with his own self-image. The playful Ousterhout, the unreluctant master. Αιωνία του τη μνήμη. Thank you.
Bonna Wescoat will talk more about archaeology, we imagine, or architecture. We'll see.
Yeah, Dauterman. All right. When Bob and Brian were first getting together, I remember vividly having a conversation with Bob when he said, "Brian is a happening guy in a happening field. I'm a happening guy in a not-so-happening field." Well, if there's anything we've learned tonight and over the years, it is that Bob Ousterhout made the study of Byzantine architecture a happening field. And we're grateful to him for that. For me, Bob made Byzantine architecture a happening field because he centered his inquiry on the people who made and used it. He was interested in the master masons, master buildings of Byzantium, and the way in which sacred architecture shaped worshippers' experience in architecture of the sacred. The communities that coalesce around and are created by architecture, visualizing community, art, material, culture, and settlement in Byzantine Cappadocia. The persons who shaped the field, including the remarkable painter, archaeologist, and museologist Osman Hamdi Bey, and the American archaeological photographer John Henry Hayes. He led with the human element, and that has made his work timeless. Given that Bob was a person who saw architecture and archaeology through the lens of people, it's not at all surprising that his work and his life were also people-centric. Bob's collaborative projects, as we've heard today, were legion, and I was fortunate to be involved in two of them. Architecture of the Sacred began as a college art association session that Bob and I had chaired on sacred architecture and experience in the period before the early modern era, so anything before 1700 CE. It created so much energy that we, and by we I mean mostly Bob, persuaded Cambridge University Press to publish the edited volume on the topic. But with a disappointing exception. Cambridge no longer wanted to publish books on art history. By their reasoning, the Western medieval papers that were part of this project were art historical, and therefore would disqualify the book. But they were happy to consider the Byzantine papers as archaeological. So we set about, sadly letting go of the Western papers, but building up the Byzantine contributions, and by we, again, I mean mostly Bob. This change gave the volume a powerful coherence, one emphasizing the interconnections across religious traditions of the Eastern Mediterranean. It was Bob that pulled it together, and I'm deeply indebted to him for believing in and fostering that joint project. The other project that I contributed to with Bob was a delightful one on Osman Hamdi Bey and the Americans, My part was much smaller, but I enjoyed it enormously, and I was deeply impressed by the way Bob worked across the different aspects of Osman Hamdi Bey, having not only a wonderful program at University of Pennsylvania, but then also taken it to the Pera Museum in Istanbul. Now, one of the joys of being on Bob's projects was being included in his friend group. Lectures and symposia with splendid dinner parties and receptions at Bob's home in Urbana-Champaign, and then later Bob and Brian's home in Philadelphia. A joyous retirement celebration symposium with his many students, and other wonderful moments, such as a New Year's Eve in Berkeley, California, singing songs from the 60s and 70s, that infectious, snorty laugh that was uniquely Bob's, and not so much the conviction that he could shift my 11-year-old daughter's black view of the Crusades, but that he would genuinely even attempt to try. I tried to interest Bob in Byzantine architecture of Samothrace, but his work with Charalambos Bakirtzis on the Evros River Valley had reached close enough for him, and Cappadocia justifiably held a greater allure. But even though he did not turn his attention to Samothrace, he gave us enough ways of understanding. We just had to channel a little bit of Bob. Thank you. And now, to close our formal remarks, I invite Brian Rose.
I want to thank Maria for organizing this wonderful gathering, and the American School, and especially Bonna, for providing the venue for it. I'll try to make this humorous because that's what Bob would have wanted. Bob, as has often been pointed out tonight, seemed to write a book a week. As a scholar myself, this was annoying. I would come home at the end of the day and he would say, "How was your day?" And I would say, "I finally finished writing that footnote that had been bothering me all week." And he would say, "I wrote another book." This happened day after day after day. Even in the last month of his life, he finished another book, Letters from Byzantium, which will be published this year. I'm not quite sure which month, but will be coming out this year from Cornucopia. He used to tell me that I was too accepting of administrative assignments because people, seeing that I was a pushover, would give me administrative assignment after administrative assignment. And he would say, "You have to learn how to say no, except to me because you were late with your article for the book Architecture of the Sacred that I'm co-editing with Bonna Wescoat. And so finish that and then say no to everything else." And at that time, and still now, I'm digging at the site of Gordian, the capital of the Phrygian kingdom in west central Turkey. And so for my birthday one year, which is in August, so I was always in the field, he said, "I've written you a Phrygian opera composed of limericks. No one but Bob would think of such a thing, and it will never, I'm sure, happen again." So here's just one stanza. "Oh, those friggin' Phrygians, they're just a bunch of brigands. On the plains of Asia Minor, we're winers and we're diners, so we'll feast on a smidgen of pigeon." You know, pretty awful, huh? I mean, I would groan when these limericks would come down the pipe, and they would come, and once he got the taste for limericks, there was a limerick every day, and then he met other people who were limerick aficionados, and it was like a volcano of limericks. So my next birthday, he said, "What do you want?" I said, "I want a day with no limericks. That's all I want." And you had to be careful what you said to Bob because he wasn't just a scholar, he was a short story writer, as Stratis was mentioning. So once I told him the story of a time when I was working as a bank teller in southeastern Ohio. It was after my first year in college, and I was bored being a bank teller because all you're doing is counting money. And I had recently seen the caper film, How to Steal $1 Million, from 1965 with Audrey Hepburn and Peter O'Toole. And I thought, I know what I'll do to pass the time. I'll figure out how to rob the bank. And so I did. I made a step-by-step set of instructions, just like Audrey Hepburn had done in How to Steal $1 Million. And I shared it with the teller next to me, saying, you know how easy it would be to rob this bank? Here's all you have to do. Step 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And the next week, he robbed the bank. He really did it. And so I told this to Bob, and he wrote a short story about it and published it called Heist. And I thought, you know, I escaped the first time. I mean, when he was arrested by the police, because I didn't really know how to rob a bank, he was arrested by the police and didn't say, Brian Rose told me how to rob this bank. But I thought, they're still going to put me in prison because now Bob has immortalized it in this story, Heist. For a while, there was a celebrity of the week. I would say, I had lunch with the director of the Ankara Museum today. And he would say, I had dinner with Ali McGraw, the story of Love Story from 1972. Or I took Morgan Freeman through Hagia Sophia as part of the PBS documentary, History of Christianity. Then there was Peter Weller, RoboCop, that he took through Hagia Sophia. But he was proudest. Of course, among his many celebrity encounters, he was proudest, and I put in 2 slides in the slideshow, of his 2 days with Martha Stewart, where he spent 2 days in a hot air balloon with Martha Stewart. It hardly seems possible, but it did happen, going over Cappadocia and talking about Byzantium and Cappadocia and Byzantine cooking. And she put it on the air. I mean, this is one of the great episodes. I mean, if you ask Bob, and I agree with him, one of the great episodes of the Martha Stewart show, Martha and Bob in a hot air balloon going over Cappadocia, which he never let me forget about. He would always say, when I would do something, he would say, you know, Martha Stewart would have done that differently. I would say, yeah, okay, I'm not Martha Stewart. But of all these achievements aside, Bob was proudest of his students. And it's great to see so many of them tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian, for being with us, for sharing your happy stories with us. We're at the end of our formal program, and we have a reception for you. But we wanted to ask if anybody would have a short thought or would like to share anything with us. Αν κάποιος θέλει να μοιραστεί μαζί μας κάποια έτσι, ανάμνηση από τον Bob, νομίζω ότι έχουμε τη δυνατότητα για λίγα λεπτά. Νομίζω ότι είπαμε αρκετά και ήταν αρκετά γεμάτη η βραδιά. Is there anybody who wants to come up? Can you, I mean, we need to be able to hear you. Sure.
Hi, Brian. My name is Mika Tsakura. I taught modern Greek at the University of Pennsylvania. I knew Bob from France and from the School of Classical Studies, and then from his students, and you know, we just met in various ways. Then he gave us a couple of talks for the Hellenic University Club. One was about Hagia Sophia, the other one was about Cappadocia. And so I became a little more comfortable to approach him and ask him about a burning question. My family, part of my family came from a part of Cappadocia, and they had a company called Moutalaski. They brought it here when they left the Asia Minor and Turkey, and for the life of me, I did not know what name was that. So I said, you know, I have this question, and you are a specialist, maybe you can tell me. So he scratched his head, he said, I don't know. First of all, he never said, no, I cannot tell you anything. He was so approachable. And then he said, oh, I know what it is. It is from an area that is Mount Atlas. And from Mount Atlas, they named the company Moutalaski. That's my 5 cents.
Okay, thank you.
I'm Dasha Resh, and I was one of Bob's students in Cappadocia program. So I would just want to say a couple of words about that on the part of students, if I may. It was in 2012, so I think it was the second or the third program he was leading. And I remember that we were driving through one of the non-touristic cities of Cappadocia after a few hours of climbing. And then we just stopped there for water or I don't know what, maybe for gas. And there was a sign advertising a cinema, which was apparently to attract visitors. It was advertising it as a 9D. And everybody was just laughing, 9D cinema in Turkey, what's that? And I remember the revelation because I realized at that moment that this was exactly the kind of the movie he was showing us at that time. It was like viewing Byzantium 9D. It was so full of everything he put into instruction, of knowledge, of sound, of vision. He could really recreate the image in front of our eyes, and he also taught us how to keep this image and reproduce it again and again when viewing Byzantine monuments. So I think I will carry it with me for the rest of my life, and I think there are many, many students who are really feeling the same way. Thank you.
So you can enjoy the show, and we can also proceed to the garden for a glass of wine and to remember Bob. Thank you very much.
Please, yes. Oh, good. That would be lovely. Thank you. Lovely. Thank you. I think we follow you.
I guess so. I blanked. So there is no. You should have come to the rescue.
He died on the 24th and his daughter, he made he had a